Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French. From the French Revolutionary Wars to the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon Bonaparte dominated Europe through his military prowess. Starting as an uninfluential artillery officer from France, Napoleon soon made a name for himself at the siege of Toulon. No one expected his dramatic rise to power and fame. Many expected him to fail. This is the story of Napoleon's first campaign, a legend of triumph, glory, and blood. The year was 1796, and the war of the First Coalition was stalling. Threatened by the new republic's ideologies, Europe waged a war that would most certainly see Paris fall. Nevertheless, France stood tall. Years had passed, and it saw two influential powers drop out of the war. The German state of Prussia to the east, and the Spanish to the south. Still, the newly formed government of Paris faced two other European superpowers, the coalition of Great Britain and Austria. Quickly, the Directory in Paris made plans to launch an invasion into the Austrian Empire, one that would most certainly knock them out of the war. It called for three major offensives. Two of these offensives would take place in the north, where two French armies would cross the River Rhine in a frontal assault against the Austrians. One of these armies was led by Victor Mourier, a famous Republican and a celebrated war veteran. Mourier would lead the attack, plunging through the Rhine before capturing the Austrian capital of Vienna. The third offensive, one that Paris expected little of, was to the south. The war-torn Army of Italy would make a feint attack, drawing Austrian troops into the area to protect their ally of Sardinia-Piedmont. If all went to plan, Mourier would capture Vienna, and the Army of Italy would knock Sardinia-Piedmont out of the war. However, many expected very little out of the Army of Italy. In fact, their victories would almost certainly be foreshadowed by Mourier to the north. Their new commander, however, had other plans. 2 days after marrying the love of his life, the young but confident Napoleon Bonaparte rode south to take command of his army. His blitzkrieg would stun all who bear witness. In 1796, the Army of Italy was the bastard of the French armed forces. Extremely manipulated of resources, many of its soldiers lacked basic equipment. One French general is quoted as saying, "Every type of equipment was in short supply. Whole battalions were without shoes, many men even without muskets and bayonets. The entire transport facilities of the army amounted to a mere 200 mules. When Napoleon arrived in April, he made quick preparations to resupply his army. Deploying Cervoni's division to the north, Napoleon was able to receive much-needed food and water from the neutral state of Genoa. This, along with supplies finally arriving from Paris, helped ease the situation. With this said, this did little to battle the sickness that plagued his army. Out of the 106,000 conscripts, some reports claim that only 63,000 were in healthy condition, and others claim that only 37,000 of these troops were supplied with the proper equipment to fight. Meanwhile, his enemies severely outnumbered him, the Austrians holding 30,000 troops to the east, while the Sardinians rallied 25,000 to their banner. Spending 2 years in Italy, Napoleon used this time to dramatically resupply his army, along with studying the history of past wars in the region. Despite being outnumbered by his enemy's armies, he knew that if he could isolate either of these forces, he could easily crush them. Luckily for him, the Piedmontese-Austrian alliance was extremely fragile, and many Austrians believed that the Piedmontese were even considering changing sides. Commander of the Austrians in the region, General Bailao, even received secret instructions not to trust his ally. Unlike the young and energetic Napoleon, Bailao was an old war hero of the Austrian Empire. 70 years of age, his army's movements were slow and predictable. Seeing Bailao's troops massed to the south of the city of Aquile, Napoleon realized that the old general probably thought Napoleon would launch an attack east to take over the port city of Genoa that the British used to offload supplies for Austria. However, this estimate was wrong. Napoleon saw Bailao's thin-stretched right flank, especially Field Marshal Argentao's extremely isolated division. Napoleon believed that if he was able to capture the city of Dego, which held a key road that connected the armies of Sardinia and Austria, he would be able to split them up and destroy them. Sardinia, who had positioned its armies in a general defense of Piedmont, would theoretically have enough time to mobilize to help the Austrians in the defense of Dego. But Napoleon rolled the dice, betting on the fragile alliance between the two nations and hoping there would be limited communication. However, Bailao struck first, launching 3 divisions as Cervoni's isolated division at Voltri. It appeared that Bailao took Napoleon by surprise. Little did he know that Napoleon bet on him moving to protect the strategic city of Genoa. Cervoni, with only 3,500 men under his command, quickly found himself overwhelmed by the 10,000-strong Austrian force. Heavy fighting broke out in the outskirts of the city. Nevertheless, Cervoni was able to make a quick and masterful withdrawal west, rendezvousing with the bulk of Napoleon's force centered around Savona. As Cervoni withdraws west, Napoleon received a letter from La Harpe's division that took him by surprise. La Harpe claimed that the isolated division of Argenteau was pushing south towards Montenotte in a coordinated attack with Bailao. Little did Argenteau know that he was marching straight into Napoleon's main force, and that the attack at Voltri by Bailao had failed to do any significant damage. Napoleon concentrated his forces to meet the incoming army, motivated to destroy Argentau's division before Bailao could come to his aid. This blunder by the Austrians could prove fatal. Due to poor staff work, the attack of Argentau's right wing did not begin until the 11th of April. On that day, the Austrians moved with 3,700 soldiers against La Harpe's position on Montenotte. Fierce fighting took place. At a moment when the French troops were wavering, General Rampont rallied them by making them swear to conquer or die, according to one eyewitness. An hour later, the Austrians began to press southeast, driving in the enemy outposts on San Giorgio and threatening La Harpe's line of retreat. The deadly Austrians fought skin and bone, and La Harpe was forced to abandon the village. Meanwhile, back in Montenotte, French forces stood tall despite the constant attacks of the Austrians. Fortunately, Napoleon arrived later that day with additional troops, aiding the defense of the French soldiers in Montenotte, and massed an additional 2,000 with La Harpe outside of San Giorgio. Napoleon had secretly dispatched Massena's division north, and he was currently marching undetected to the village of Montenotte, threatening to surround the Austrian forces. Fog shrouded the area at dawn on the 12th of April. When it cleared, several French cannons began firing from Montenotte on the Austrians below, and Argentau soon saw that he was confronted by a large force. Shortly afterward, Napoleon launched his attack. Massena's soldiers, undetected due to the fog, launched themselves on the weakly held Austrian right flank at Montenotte, swamping a cavalry division with superior numbers, catching them by surprise. Horses were shot from underneath them as they attempted to retreat. The Austrians bravely held on to the road, and bloody battle broke out. However, no bravery was enough to stop Massena's steamrolling force, which massacred the regiment and quickly captured the village with ease. An Austrian infantry regiment outside of Montenotte, upon hearing of the French inside the village, panicked and fled east. While Massena continued overwhelming Argentau's right, La Harpe fell on the Austrians at San Giorgio. Once again, the Austrians held on bravely, but Napoleon's reinforcements were too much for the tired Austrians, forcing them to retreat. But news of French troops behind their line quickly turned an orderly retreat into a panicked rout. Napoleon ruthlessly launched his fresh cavalry down the mountain hills, cutting down hordes of fleeing Austrians. Out of the 10,000 men that Argentau wielded, a mere 700 marched back to the city of Dego. 2,000 were killed by the French forces, while the rest were taken prisoner. Napoleon had secured a surprising victory against the Austrians, who now reared back in retreat. Focusing his attention on the remaining enemy troops, Thierry's fresh division from the south moved in, forcing a decisive battle against the Austrian at Milsmo, taking an additional 4,000 prisoners. Napoleon had obtained his objective of splitting his enemy's forces in two by holding Dego. Now focusing his attention on the outnumbered Sardinians, his divisions moved north, forcing a decisive battle at Mondavi, crushing the Sardinian forces under General Cali. The army of Italy, once the bastard of the French forces, was now glorified with Napoleon's command. With the Austrians retreating back to Aquile in force, and with the Sardinians stunned by the speed of Napoleon's blitzkrieg, an armistice was signed on April 28th. A week later, a number of Sardinian fortresses were put under French garrison, and Piedmont was forced out of the war. In a span of 14 days, Napoleon had inflicted 25,000 coalition casualties, compared to his 6,000. Back in Paris, Napoleon was celebrated as a hero. The bastard army of Italy was now glorified with the spotlight, and in the span of the past month, a number of hardened soldiers were formed in the conflict. For the first time ever, Napoleon had secured his first crushing victory. Although Europe did not know it yet, his winning streak would continue for the next 2 decades, crowning himself Emperor of the French and making every nation in Europe yield to his strength.